Hello, Steve. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, Lian. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, honestly, really my pleasure. And even more so now I know about I say topic. we were just talking about, we don't actually know what to call the topic. Hopefully by the end of this, we will know. But I'm so delighted to be having this conversation with you. So we agreed that I would start by sharing why we're even having this conversation, which was off the back of our last episode together. I then went and listened to some episodes on your own podcast recommended by a friend. And he is really into magic, as I am. And so particularly directed me to listen to some episodes with you and Daniel Ingram. And the particular ones I listened to were about magic. And I was listening thinking, Steve, you dark horse, I had no idea about this, because it was so clear to me, like listening, like Steve is no innocent here. Like he's not asking questions from a place of like being clueless about this, because he wouldn't be able to ask the question he's asking. So I was like, Steve must be into magic to be having this conversation. Oh, well, that's a whole nother like view on Steve that I just didn't have before. So again, we started exploring before we hit record and said, like, how about we just talk about that? And so here we are talking about that. But the question that just occurred to me that I wanted to ask you before I hit record, and I was like, no, I'll save it, is you alluded to kind of almost like publicly being a muggle. And so is this an unusual conversation for you to have where you're kind of outing yourself? Like, how is this something you wouldn't normally do? And how do you feel about that, if so?
Well, I haven't outed myself yet.
You haven't, but I'm expecting.
I think the Muggle defense still holds. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, on my podcast, which you listen to, Guru Viking podcast, it's an interview podcast. So most of the time, I'm interviewing somebody else. Mm-hmm. And as the interviewer, of course, it depends on the style of interview. You know, we have more of a conversation. I think in our last episode, that's a different style. That's a conversational style. But my interview style on that podcast is not really conversational, in the sense that I'm sort of reflecting on what the guest has said, and we have a two-way. It sometimes goes that way, but pretty rare. I prefer just to mainly interrogate. I prefer to be the interrogator rather than interrogated. You know? So I think it's yeah. So I think if you want creating the space of the openness or the vacuum as the questioner for the guest to fill, and is the better way around. Yeah. So that's very interesting. Daniel Ingram's an interesting guy, actually, an ER doctor, although he's retired now, a retired ER doctor. Perhaps your listeners some of them will know who he is. He became notorious for writing a book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, which I think the subtitle was An Unusually Hardcore Dharma Guide or something like this. It's quite a tome. And in that he claims to be, in fact, he signs it, Daniel Ingram, the Arhat. And the Arhat is the fourth of 4 levels of enlightenment that one can achieve in the Buddhist school of the Theravada, or the old school. It's the sort of earliest form of Buddhism that still survives. And it survives in Southeast Asia, places like Burma, Sri Lanka, Thailand, places like that. Anyway, it's a big influence on the modern mindfulness movement that we see in America, and of course also in the UK, in Europe, through people like Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, et cetera, that whole crew of people that came over. Those people actually sampled many different meditation styles, but their meditation approach heavily influenced by people like Goenka, Mahasi Sayadaw, and his successor U Pandita, and also very interesting figures like Dipa Ma and Munindra. But anyway, that sort of style of practice, Theravada style, is quite influential, I think. In that style, they have these 4 levels of enlightenment: stream entry, the first one, and then once returner. Some other things happen to you at that time. And sort of these are 4 epiphanies, or 4 completions of certain cycle of insights. The third one is a never returner. And the fourth is Arhat. And Arhat, quite a high attainment. And traditionally, often, although this is a bit debatable, but certainly these days, one doesn't disclose such attainments. There are sort of rules against it. It's not done really. You can hint. You can hint by talking about things that only an Arhat should know about, as if you have experienced them. But you can indirectly hint. And people do that. And if you know the code, you can hear people do that sort of thing, and they'll tell you where they are sometimes. In fact, one gets the feeling sometimes that they can't wait to tell you where they are. But that's another story. But anyway, he was quite notorious and controversial for announcing to everybody that he had considered himself to be an Arhat. And of course, he had a lot of backlash, a lot from certain traditional people, and also secular meditation people, a lot of backlash. Who is this guy claiming this, etc., etc. That was some years ago, actually, but he's gone on to be a somewhat controversial figure because of that. Now, the odd thing about Daniel is that despite claiming to be this level 4 kind of guy, he doesn't do the usual things that you'd imagine someone who's claiming enlightenment to do, like have many Rolls Royces and devotees, chasing him around. Doesn't really have that guru thing going on. So he's a very interesting guy, and I've interviewed him several times on the podcast, actually, and he really is one of the pioneers of a pragmatic Dharma movement, as they call it, of people who are attempting to, achieve these various different states and so on. But I could go on about Daniel Ingram. He's a very interesting chap. And in that interview you're talking about, he reveals another of his interests, which is in magic, Western occultism, and also Buddhist magic. Achieved through, the workings are done through, of course, various different rituals and symbols, but also through states of high concentration. So it seems a prerequisite to most Buddhist magic, and the use of Siddhi and so on, at least in the streams that Daniel's experiments with, it's high states of samadhi, or high states of concentration. And he achieves that through staring at a candle flame for 14 hours a day for 10 days or so. Yeah, so it's very interesting. He's a very interesting guy, and he's very open, talking about all these experiences he has, very open about his attainments, which he redefines slightly from the traditional attainments. He limits what it means to be an Arhat compared to the traditional texts, which sometimes is like quite supernatural almost and remarkable, and he's criticized for that. And he's willing to experiment with all these different sorts of styles, using his meditation horsepower to investigate Western occultism. And in that interview, which is like 2.5 hours long, I think, we go through different magical systems, and I ask him about his opinions on, everything from Enochian to, Goetia magic to you name it. I throw it at him and see what he says. And because he's a very knowledgeable guy and very good speaker, it's quite a fascinating conversation. Yeah.
And you have deftly, but I've noticed, avoid answering the question. And I come back to the fact that in order for you to have asked the questions that you asked,
right,
you must have an understanding, appreciation, worldview of magic yourself, is my sense. Oh, I think I've lost you. You've magically broken the internet, Steve.
Hello?
1, 2. Yeah. You're like, I know my way out of this. Just killed you.
I didn't touch anything. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Sorry. You said I must have an appreciation, you said. That's the last thing I heard.
I said, I was leaving it open for you to define, but I said appreciation, worldview, understanding of magic, in order to be able to have the level of conversation you had with him and ask the questions you have. So what I would love to know is your experience of magic.
Well, yes, in order to have that sort of a conversation with him, it did require some familiarity with different magical ideas and systems and ways of thought. And I think, like a lot of people, I've always been very interested in sort of meditation-y things, religious things, even actually philosophical things, but also in magic, as magic is an integral part of the worldview of many cultures even today. Ours less so, I think, although it seems it used to be a magical way of viewing the world. And it, I think, has been criticized by a more scientific materialist view, which I think is at least one of the dominant views of our culture at this time, as being, well, it's not based on anything. It's superstition. It's a way of explaining things we don't understand. It's a way of relating to the uncertainty of the natural world and its precociousness. The weather changes, sicknesses come and go, and so on. But it's because of the sky god of the thunder, or we must have upset the hill spirits or something like that. It's a sort of a way of looking for patterns in a primitive kind of a way, and which is superseded by science. And I think there's truth to that. Actually, there's truth to that, but I don't think magic is only a useful way of describing reality in a kind of, it doesn't work really as a science, I think, as well as science does, but it has other uses in terms of symbol and meaning and ways of navigating the unknown. I think it has that interesting and also touching areas of life that are subjective and difficult to assess, at least at this point in science. So I think the ideal would be some kind of ability to be both in that artistic imaginal realm and also in the logical rational realm, and for them to somehow be together, or at least to have an interesting friction.
Yeah.
And in fact, of course, as you know, Lian, but many cultures today still emphasize magic as, or if we think of magic, I don't know how we could define it. I mean, Crowley's definition, of course, is to do with, making something happening by the force of your will and so on. I mean, that's a limited definition of magic, I suppose. It's a good one, I think. But also explaining things in terms of spirits and so on. In Tibetan medicine, for example, which is still practiced widely, the four causes of illness or disturbance of the humors, which is how they explain illness, is bad diet, bad lifestyle. Okay, so far, I think science can agree. Seasonal change, also, which is said to affect the humors, and then the fourth is provocations, or dön. Dön is what they call them. Upsetting the nagas or the spirits or something like that, or even perhaps being cursed or possessed, actually, or oppressed by spiritual forces or spiritual people. That's very interesting indeed. And that same idea, a book that I read early on, which was very interesting to me, is I'm sure you've read Dion Fortune's Psychic Self-Defense.
Yes.
So interesting. So that I'm very interested historically in that whole period, Dion Fortune, those sorts of people, the emergence of science and industrial kind of emergence alongside this contact with the East, the Theosophical Society and all that sort of thing, along with a sort of revival of pagan or Western esoteric ideas. This very interesting mix that was going on in Britain and Germany and other places like that. I find that a very fascinating period of time, and the sorts of things that those people can say at that time at that time of history, I think are very amazing. They can talk very magically on the one hand, with a totally straight face, and on the other hand, engaged in science and so on. It's very fascinating. What do you think?
Yes. Oh, I love so much what you said. I'll start with what you just said, and then there's something you said at the beginning that I want to come to as well. So yeah, I find it fascinating how when we look back at some of the most prominent and recognized thinkers of the past, scientists and economists, they often had I don't think it was secret at the time. I think you're saying they were actually, fairly out there with it, but now it's become this secret part of them where it's not known that actually they were practicing magicians as well as being scientists or something. And it didn't seem like that was a dichotomy then. And that for me is something that I often think it's easy to see that and think, oh, it's just because they didn't know as much as we do now. But I actually feel there's something more going on there. There's an openness to something beyond the known that really served them. That, as you say, culturally, we've kind of got clung so much to the known that can be proven by science. We've lost the ability to explore in the unknown. So I love what you've just said there. The thing that really hit me, and I love the way you said this, was the way that we can see the culturally going from this, or as a species, going from a kind of magical worldview where we use magic to explore what's happening in the world. And then we can think, okay, then we got science. So we got rid of that and we don't need magic anymore. And the way you said it, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, it's so clear how we just threw the baby out with the bathwater and didn't recognize there's aspects of life where magic is deeply serving and doesn't need to even be, I don't think, in conflict with what we can measure scientifically. Again, for me, it's more comes back to what I was saying. It just falls in what we can't currently measure with science or report on with science. It feels to me it's much more in that realm, and recognizing there are right now limitations to what we're able to understand. The other thing I was hearing in what you said was that was it. It was actually when you were talking about Crowley's definition of magic, actually what popped into my mind was Daniel Ingram's, and it's something like, I may have this wrong, you'll probably remember. I think he is like consciousness plus intention. I think he defines it as, which I think is awesome. I love that. And it's kind of like, and that in itself opens up this whole, well, given how little we can actually even like determine what the hell consciousness is with science, it may suggest that we have got some limitations in terms of trying to use science as the answer to understand all of this.
Yes, I think many scientists agree, actually.
Yes, I think, I think most do actually, don't they? I mean, it's not, I think it's like the hard problem, isn't it, for good reason. So that in itself says a lot.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if we think of magic, to me, I think, to me, for whatever my opinion's worth, but to me, magic can be associated with making things happen through means that are not sort of like conjuring a relationship or manifesting a job opportunity, things like that. Some kind of working cheat code, if you like, with the universe somehow to get things to happen that, I suppose, round the back door sort of thing. But, and I think that's interesting. To me, that's never particularly interested me. I think when one gets something through the back door, there's things can happen in mysterious ways, but when one pushes for something through, if you want, backdoor means, then what are you going to do with it when you've got it? How can you hold it if you don't have that structure? And of course, that's one aspect of magic. The other aspect of magic, the great work, as they sometimes call it, isn't it, is one's own apotheosis or something like that, But once again, in other words, one sees it as a sort of spiritual quest, right, of refinement of the individual or something like that. It can even be more Taoist in that sense, I think. I think magic also, the lens of magic is interesting lens to listen with, I think.
Yes.
That's interesting, to stop and listen. For example, tarot cards, if you think about those, right? Of course, there are many ways to think about them, but one way to think about, say tarot cards, that's just an obvious example that everyone's heard of, is it forces you to stop and take a different perspective. So you pull a card, and maybe you're thinking about a situation or whatever the case is, and you pull a card out, and it has associations. Whether you know the associations or not, you make associations, and then you say, okay, well, let me see the situation from this perspective. It helps you get out of your own perspective and see things from a different angle. So whether there's any magic to that, in the sense of the cards are psychically, producing something, or they're showing you the future because of I think that's not so relevant at the level of it can be used as a way of seeing things differently. Or if you're sensitive to, I interviewed somebody else, this Australian couple, amazing. I think one of the first 3 or 4 episodes I did, and they spent a lot of time with the Aboriginal people of Australia, long time with them, and they talked a lot about dream time and the way that even today, this couple they listen to the birds and they notice the birds, and they're able to somehow, by recognizing certain birds appearing at certain times. They told me some stories in the interview of certain birds, a warning bird coming when something bad was going to happen and things like that. They're sensitized to the animal signs, as they're sometimes called. I think that's interesting. Now, does it matter if the animal is actually, independent of your own imagination, giving you a sign? Well, not necessarily. If you're willing to hold the magical view as a lens rather than taking it as an absolute fact, then it can at least give you the opportunity to stop and think, oh, I've seen this thing. I've seen this animal doing something unusual. I could give some examples, I suppose, and then you say, stop, reevaluate the day. Hang on a moment. This is strange. What's going on? Actually, let me rethink what I'm doing. Let me just double check that I'm not automatically, through the force of habit and unconsciousness, walking into a situation that I should think twice about. They have that in dream yoga, actually. When you learn to lucid dream, when you notice something like a glitch in the matrix, they often ask you to do a reality check in the daytime. So, because the problem with dreams is you see strange things. I dreamt not so long ago that I was taking a speedboat to an island off New York to meet Joe Pesci at his mansion. Now, yeah. So obviously, to me at the time, that seemed perfectly normal and perfectly fine. It was very strange, but I didn't notice how strange it was, right? And so one of the things that they do to train you to notice that you're dreaming when you're dreaming, lucid dreaming, is when you go around your life and something weird happens, or some weird coincidence happens, or something unusual or odd, you do a reality check. So you get in the habit of noticing strange things and checking if you're dreaming. So they'll do things like you pull your finger because apparently in your dreaming that it goes long, or you move your hand back and forth like that and see if your fingers remain the same number as they are, consistently. Apparently that changes in the dream. Various other things you can do. So it's a sort of causes you to stop and think and ponder. And of course, in the spiritual application of dream yoga, the sense in which one believes the dream to be real, here I am going out to meet Joe Pesci, is correlated to the ways in which I take many of the appearances of my life to be real also. I make many assumptions about life, about who I am, what's going on, the nature of reality. Many of these assumptions in these sorts of traditions are said to be mistaken. So, of course, isn't that what we do with spiritual investigation? We have these epiphanies and so on. See through our assumptions, right? So the idea is that if you get good at recognizing you're dreaming when you're dreaming, then we can wake up also in the dream of illusion that is this waking life also. So I think it's so fascinating, all these sorts of ideas. So there, I think it's magic, if we think of it like that. It's a listening. It could be a listening tool, or a tool of waking up, sobering up, that sort of idea. Magic as a tool of clarity and waking up and sobriety and listening. How does that make sense? Surely if you engage in magic, you're going to become irrational, superstitious, and etc., etc. Yes, that can happen too. That can happen too.
That definitely can be a shadow, actually, of
Yeah.
magic. The thing that really hit me as I started to more consciously, like my journey into magic initially wasn't a conscious choosing, and then as it became a conscious choosing, I was looking around at people who were kind of, out there as magical practitioners. And it really hit me how, in the main, they appeared to be some of the most intelligent, conscious, and rational people out there. And I was like, that's a surprise. That is not what I was expecting to see out there at all. But I think it's for the very, very reason you've said, that used in the way that you're describing, it is indeed a tool for sobering up, waking up, seeing things more as they actually are, which is strangely kind of more magical, as in we stop believing that something is as we see it is, and we start to see it as filled with I guess all of the possibility and wonder, and not of the material that it actually is. And so I love what you've said there. It's kind of the opposite, I think, of what people might think a sort of worldview of magic could actually lead to.
Yeah, access to the imaginal and the creative aspects also. This is another, isn't it, possible dimension. If we take magic to be a very broad definition. Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. And talking to people as I do on my podcast from all kinds of, it's focused on sort of contemplative stuff, spiritual stuff, you could say. Not a lot of magic, although it does come up a lot, because, you might think of Buddhism as one might think of Buddhism as a rather dry, austere kind of religion. And in some ways, it does have that aspect. But, you can't really go 5 minutes without discovering Siddhis, these special powers, and all these flying, Siddhas and Gantapa and all this sort of thing. And the Buddha even himself doing all these sorts of strange things. So even the sort of what one would imagine to be, as it's sometimes presented as, a philosophy of mind or a science of the mind, Buddhism is sometimes presented as that, I think wrongly. But nonetheless, it's got a lot of magic in it too. So despite that, I don't try to emphasize it exactly. I'm not sort of pursuing it in my interviews. It often comes up.
Yes. Oh, I love that. It's fascinating, actually. I read, do you know Dean Radin? He's been on the show, but he's written several books about magic. He wrote one, I can't remember the name of it, that it was about that actual topic, and how it, in those traditions where Siddhis are a kind of known thing, they're also seen, and I think you and Daniel Ingram spoke about this as well, they're kind of like, they're known, but we're not going to focus on them. They're kind of almost like a byproduct, like we're not going to make them the point of this. But I think that can go so far the other way, where it's almost like it's not even a thing, and let's just pretend it doesn't exist. Where, as you say, to the mainstream view on, say, Buddhism, you just would have no idea that magic was part of the tradition.
Yeah. And magic, is such a part of our culture. I said it wasn't, but now if we take another angle on it, the positive thinking movement, the idea of the unconscious, everything from affirmations to limiting beliefs and so on and so forth. One's view and assumptions affect one's perception. If I go through life expecting people to just reject me or think I'm not very good or something, then I'll interpret a wide range of things that way that are not that way. Someone blanks me in the street and I think, gosh, see, there's further evidence of my insignificance, but maybe they just didn't see me. Maybe they're wrapped up in something of their own and they didn't see me, and so etc. etc. So all these sorts of subjective area of positive psychology and of course then therefore self-help, etc., even counseling and psychotherapy, I think, has magical aspects to it. Intention, will, even the words you choose to use. Of course, this is a great magical idea, isn't it? The power of words and language to shape reality, or at the very least, influence your experience of reality. And the way you carry yourself affects the way people treat you, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's so many layers of that. Is that magic? Well, from a certain point of view, you could think of it like that, because in most magical systems, the first trainings are in one's containment of oneself, isn't it? Where are the leaks? How are you using your words? How do you use your thoughts? You know, your discipline of your life and routines and so on, and the way you interact, noticing these sorts of things, plugging the leaks, right?
Yes.
Seems to be a common thing. Now, of course, they talk about ectoplasm or chi or prana. You know, they have a way of talking about it, but on another level, from a purely psychological level, you know, I think it's an interesting idea. And of course, the mainline religions that still exist today are full of magical things.
Yes.
So it's sort of everywhere and nowhere at the same time, I think.
It really
and
is.
that's typical, I think, of magic. And it's good to have that view, to be able to completely have that light touch with it. That allows one to engage with it as one would a game of imagination, and be open to that, listening to that creative, imaginal, intuitive realm, but on the other hand, without concretizing it, which is the domain of science. I think perhaps concretizing it becomes, I think, at that time limiting. It loses what it's there for, this sort of other perspective, perhaps. I mean, I must say, I don't know if this is a tremendously coherent idea. It's just, we're just musing, right? Or at least I'm musing. You seem to have more coherence. How do you use magic? How do you think of it? You said to me before that you're heavily involved in shamanism, but I'm very curious. You said that your initial contact with magic was not by choice, and then you pursued it deliberately. Could you perhaps recount that story if you haven't already?
I can. I just want to quickly come to something you said then about where it's kind of magic's actually kind of infused everywhere without us not necessarily recognizing it. And what that made me think of is how we see things like psychotherapy more as a science culturally. Like if someone was to name, well, they think it's actually, you know, there's something very psychological, and you know, like Jung, for example, who's probably, you know, one of the godfathers of psychotherapy, so much of his work was influenced by shamanism. And of course, you know, just in the way that you talked about, it's actually like, you know, more magic than anything else. And yet we've just, because of the way we've named it and structured it, that's out of view a lot of the time. So I just thought that was such a great example of how even the people who think they are really divorced from magic are often, you know, using systems that are, you know, come directly from magic.
Yes, and perhaps like I say, even medicine, the healing power of a good bedside manner. What is that?
Yeah,
we don't really understand it. Now, of course, we know it works, but we don't really understand it. What about the placebo effect? What about the power of positive thinking in aiding the healing? Or, if you like, what happens if you're determined to die, no matter what treatment they throw at you? I think often people turn to that sort of, they say, okay, I've got cancer, or okay, I've got whatever it might be. And I know many people that they advocate this sort of full participation at every level of the patient's being in the recovery process. Seems to have some sort of effect, you know. How repeatable is that in studies? I think it's rather mysterious. Rupert Sheldrake, of course, who everyone knows, I expect, speaks a lot about this sort of idea. And it is baffling. It's well beyond my pay grade, I must say, intellectually. But what I have gleaned from it is that there's an awful lot we don't understand, even in the realms, the hardest realms of science, such as medicine and, you know, well, of course, now we can go all Deepak Chopra on it, quantum mechanics, you know, physics. It's really confusing. I have some physicist friends. They're extremely intelligent. And they insist that it's mostly mystery. And they should know. That's amazing. Now, it's not to say that it can't be understood, but it's to say that, gosh, there's so much mystery there. I think mystery is the realm of magic.
Yes, I was about to say, aka magic, really. Yes, yeah. I love that. I'll give you a very Cliff's Notes version of how I ended up involved in magic. So I guess the bit that I probably do need to say is, it seems looking back that I was kind of always wired for magic as much as I really didn't want to be. So I've always had, it was funny actually, I was interviewed a chap who is a researcher of psychedelics, probably the best way to describe. So he's a science guy, and his work is around psychedelics, plant medicines, things like that. And as I was sharing my experiences with him, he said, oh yeah, so what I would say is, like, you've just got a naturally psychedelic mind. And I was just like, oh, I'm kind of glad that I finally had that diagnosis. So that really is my experience. I used to have hallucinations and dissociative episodes and all sorts of strange things that kind of were happening for me, which I really hated, was terrified by.
What did you hallucinate?
Oh my goodness, all sorts of this. It started happening when I was a teenager, and typically it would be like a hypnagogic or hypnopompic one, where I would be woken from sleep and then have a really, like, it was literally in the room happening. I'd be wide awake, eyes open. And then the first one that ever happened was my father had come in late at night, woke me up, and I looked and saw all the, like, I was a teenager, so posters on my walls, and all the posters were kind of like shuffling around on my walls. So I sat up in bed, started screaming my lungs out. And so my poor father must have been like, what's happening? She's being killed, like ran through the bedroom door, like, Lee, you okay? And I was like, look at my posters. And that was the first time it was just like, okay, he's not seeing what I'm seeing here. And then from then on, I had them really regularly. And so I was terrified, because I seemed to not be able to have the ability, when they were happening, to know that was what was happening. As far as I was concerned, it was happening. And there were typically things that shouldn't be happening, if you know what I mean. And that was something that became increasingly a challenge for me about 4 years ago, where I started having those about 4 times a week, which was really disruptive, because, you know, I'd wake up, be absolutely terrified, wake my husband up, kind of like, then eventually would realize it was hallucination, and then I have to kind of like calm myself down to be able to get back to sleep. So I then had a conversation with a shaman who was saying, it seems like you have this kind of opening, I don't know how she, like a sort of sensitivity opening to spirit, that's kind of like trying to get its way in, but the only way it can do is when you're kind of asleep, therefore you don't have your defenses up. If you consciously choose to open to it, chances are it won't have to keep coming through this way. And I was like, I don't really like the sounds of that. That sounds like kind of being chased out of the village with pitchforks territory, but I'm desperate at this point. So that was the kind of first very tentative steps towards consciously opening to it. And the fact that worked, as in I went from having like 4 of those a week to a couple of year, literally, you know, just after that conversation, said to me, there's something in this. I don't really understand what's just happened by me literally just agreeing to be open to this, but something has clearly shifted. And then I'm trying to like think of like key important points, because there's lots of details that I could share that are going to make this really long-winded. But over the last few years, and I think it was linked to this, I began practices that you could describe as, I guess, like the nature-based path of soul and connecting to the wild, I guess, in a more like animist way. I wasn't necessarily thinking it is definitely that, but it just felt that that was something that made sense to me. So spending a lot of time with an oak tree, and I guess quite communing with the oak tree. And so started to recognize how, in the way that you talked about the couple with the birds, how that felt like a conversation that was real to me, that was happening. I can feel the emotion rising because it's something that I don't seem to be able to have the ability to talk about in a kind of purely kind of like logical way, like it really has been, and still is a very profound opening. And it wasn't like I needed to label that. It wasn't like I was thinking, you know, this is you know, it wasn't magic as far as I'm concerned. It certainly wasn't shamanism. It wasn't anything. It was just the experience I was having. Then the way that was speaking to me became increasingly clear, to the point where I had this clear message to train in shamanism, which was so unwelcome. It was not something I wanted to do at all. But the way that I kept being told this was kind of increasingly insistent, which is the whole story in itself. But anyway, that's what took me onto the path, firstly of shamanism. And then I started to recognize, like, okay, I guess this is magic. Like, I suppose it is magic. And then I became more open to other forms of magic. So it was kind of, like I say, I kind of like weaved my way here. And then it was only very recently, at the beginning, that I had this theory for years. Jonathan, my business partner, and I had this theory that we used to sometimes talk about neurodivergences and being more wired for spirit stroke magic. And then early this year, I was diagnosed with autism. And then literally a week afterwards, found out that the autistic brain has a hypermetabolism of DMT, which I'm sure you know is the spirit molecule. And it was like, suddenly, oh, the psychedelic mind now all makes sense. And so, yeah, hey, turns out I was wired for magic all along. It's just taken me a hell of a long time to get to the point where I am consciously choosing that.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Such a Cliff's Notes. That was.
Yeah.
But yeah, hope that answers your question.
It does. Might I ask you then a bit about that?
Yes, of course.
So if you had that proclivity, when you started to get involved in shamanism, a more structured path, I suppose, than having, you know, nothing at all other than your own intuition. And then you said you also got involved in other magical systems. I'd be interested in what they are. But how do you now relate to that proclivity? Are you able to, do you attempt to control it, or do you understand it better? Do you direct it towards things, or are you just open to when it sort of emerges or comes out? And how does it do so, if so? So I'm curious how you relate to that, how entering training and then coming to the point you are now, how you relate to that proclivity, which before was showing up at unwelcome random times when you're waking up in the middle of the night and so on. You've turned towards it, it seems. And then the second, after your conversation with the shaman, and then the second step, or a further step, was this training aspect. So how did it evolve at that point?
So the quote that I mentioned earlier of Daniel Ingram just popped into my mind, how it feels to me that it's the intention part of it that's really shifted, in that it was very unintentional. It was just like my mind seemed to want to work that way. And then other aspects of me really didn't want it to work that way. And so there was like no intention other than like kind of do what I could to shut it down. Whereas now there is definitely the intention that yeah, kind of directing it when it's appropriate, when it's serving, when it's beneficial, which has meant there's almost no, I'm not saying it's entirely, but almost no times now where it happens in unwelcome ways. So that's been the kind of real shift in that. So how I might intentionally use it would be, I don't know, for example, journeying, like shamanic journeying, I guess more intentionally asking and listening for an intuitive sense, or speaking to my guides. So all things that just would have sounded like just nonsense not that long ago. Like I would have heard someone else saying the things I've just said and just thought, how ridiculous, quite frankly. Yeah, there's really and I think that was also me getting over myself. There was a kind of a lot of judgment I had about these things, like, oh, that's just woo, that's just delusional. And it's not to say there isn't aspects of this that can be, but I guess over time, direct experience has shown me that, you know, whilst I agree with you, there is like a kind of aspect of this that is unknown, imaginal. There's also things that have happened that I'm like, there is something also happening that is beyond anything I can explain rationally. And I needed to be able to have those experiences to be able to say, okay, there's something, there's a there.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And so you've learned in your shamanic training then to journey and encounter guides and entities of various sorts.
And you know, this is an ongoing training, but already it's really helped, I guess, contextualize things that were just happening naturally and bring a sense of, like you say, structure and intention to things that kind of were just happening. The experience that I had prior to that in nature, I can see now, weren't really that different. I mean, it was lovely how, I'm probably going to get emotional again, because the relationship I had with the oak tree had been so profound for me. My very first day of shamanic training, what we were asked to do was go out into the woods. It's held in some woods. I was to go out and find a tree, and I was just like, oh, I'm home. These are my people. This is my work. Yeah, so it was kind of like putting some understanding around things that were just had already been my life and my work without me really consciously recognizing it was.
Gosh, yeah, that's remarkable. Did you have any, as is sometimes said to be the case with people with that kind of proclivity, any great illness or tragedy?
Yes, it's funny because I think I'm I don't know how to describe it. Like naturally, I'm like Pollyanna with rose-tinted glasses. So it's funny because like I probably had most kinds of trauma happen to me that you can name, but I don't really experience myself as that. Like and I can see now how, you know, it's often talked about as like shamanic sickness in shamanic, right, you know, where it's like known that that's needed to kind of break you open. And for me, probably the biggest example is that I had like a traumatic incident happen where I was attacked, basically, beaten up and sexually assaulted. And for 15 years after that, I had chronic facial pain and panic attacks. And I can see now that that was that for me. And the interesting thing was the resolution of that happened with my father dying suddenly. And it was the day after he died, it's like the opening happened, where it was kind of like that led to a whole series of events that kind of led me to where I am now. Look back and, you know, that kind of classic join the dots backwards. But I can see all of that was necessary to bring me to where I am.
Very interesting.
This has ended up becoming you interviewing me, which is not fair, Steve. That was not the idea of this.
The old switcheroo.
Yes, you are such a natural interrogator.
Yeah, well, that's remarkable.
Bring ourselves back to what the intention of this. We've been talking for quite some time as well. Where should we go now? How should we bring this to some semblance of an ending to the conversation. I think we probably need to have another episode talk about something else as well. In my sense, it feels like we've still got so much to talk about. But what occurs to you as, I guess, something that you feel could be helpful to listeners, of interest to listeners, if they perhaps want to take a step towards, sorry, my dog's at the door as well, a more, again, like magical lens, a way of listening magically, as you described it?
Well, actually, I would, I'll happily answer that, but I think perhaps I would be curious what you would say to somebody who...
You're not getting away with that again, Steve.
Oh, we're not doing that? Okay. Well, after your story, it just seems natural to say something reflective on it. But okay, if you insist. I think what advice or suggestion would I have for somebody to access that? Yeah. Let me think. What's the best way of saying it? Like I said, this pausing and this listening, it seems to be a sensitizing. Oh, your dog's come back in now. It seems to be a sensitizing to that dimension. I'm still recovering from your story. It was very interesting indeed. Let me think. How to say? Well, I think it's hard to say exactly. I think to pull the thread of one's questioning. That's quite interesting. Or to look outside at something long enough to see it not primarily through its relationship to you. Very often, I think, we go out and we see things. It's very much related to us. The tree is over there, and it's only over there because I'm over here. So still one's very much self-referenced. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. That's fine. You have to be somewhere after all. But if you sit for long enough, and for different people, that's, if you're a little bit hard-headed like I can be, then it can take some time. But some people get it more quickly, is to look at nature and observe it. This is one way, for example, that comes to me, on its own terms. When you're talking about this connection with the oak tree, and you have difficulty putting it into words and difficulty concretizing it in language, like the sort of language we speak. Yeah, because, of course, trees don't talk in English language. But there is some life in a tree, and there is some character there, and there is some relationship or interactivity that can be happen if you can relate on that level with a tree, for example. And how do you really get to know somebody in any relationship, dating or whatever the case might be, or a friend? Such a relationship really begins to deepen when you begin to see the person who they are, not rather just seeing them always as an instrumentally. Oh, this is an attractive person. I like them because I feel good around them. It's still self-reference. So when you begin to see, I see you, I see more about you, and you see a bit beyond yourself. That, I think, is when human relationships also can become a bit deeper, and also more rich and interesting. People become much more interesting when you get to know them for who they are, rather than limit your relationship to them based on how you feel around them, or what you're going to say to them, or this sort of self-referential thing. Wow, this person's so much more interesting than I realized, because you're not limited by your own filter. Maybe something like that. I'm kind of groping around, but I think that's an idea. In nature, for example, to look at the water, and rather than seeing it as something that could make you wet or that you could drink, just seeing it and then going beyond yourself, or relaxing, eventually that self-referential reflex can relax, and one can open up into a different sort of contact with, say, nature or the environment. People do that, don't they, with vision quests and so on. But I don't think one needs to necessarily be so performative and grand as that, although vision quests are, of course, wonderful. But just as simple. It's there in the nature, what I'm saying, or indeed in a person. But it's so much harder, I think, to do that with a person. But it's there in the nature. And you don't have to necessarily conjure it from a cauldron or something. It's there in the nature, at least an access point. And begin to, and then say, well, it's difficult to express. It's difficult to formulate. Yes, it is. Poets and mystics and artists have attempted to hint at it or point at it through art. But it can't really be bottled and captured in that kind of framework, as you so demonstrated when you tried to talk about the oak tree. And you communicated it, but you couldn't say something about it, but it still came across. So I think an attempt to investigate nature on its own, from its own point of view, or at least to see a little bit beyond one's own self, could perhaps be a first step.
I don't think you could have articulated that better, Steve. It's so captured in the words that I didn't have, the way the oak tree and more recently the rose. Actually, I always keep a rose on my desk now because I'm in a similar practice with the rose. And for me, the way you just spoke was, and again, I did this intuitively. It wasn't like I knew this was the way, but it really was a process of becoming the oak tree rather than seeing it through my eyes. And it was like becoming it, knowing myself as the tree and the experience of the tree. And for me, that's, and I so agree with you. We, through our work, we take people on one end of the spectrum, vision quests. On the other end, one of the practices we invite all our clients into is simply having a sit spot or finding a special tree. It really can be something, or having a rose on your desk. It really can be really simple portals to this way of being. Thank you so much. I loved our conversation, even if you are terribly naughty and don't want me to interview you. I will forgive you because it has been a gorgeous conversation. Where can people find out more about you and your wonderful work, Steve?
GuruViking.com, www.guruviking.com. That's also where the podcast is that you mentioned. You can just search YouTube for Guru Viking, and it's all there.
If you want to hear more of Steve interviewing someone, I suggest you go there. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.